The Varath conclave happened once every 11 years, which was, by most diplomatic standards, not nearly enough. The station that hosted it, Kaelos Prime, a structure so large it generated its own weather systems on the interior levels, had been scrubbed, rescrubbed, and politically sanitized for 3 standard months in advance. Delegations from 42 sovereign systems had descended upon it with their entourages, their customs, their dietary restrictions, and their exhausting ceremonial requirements, until the station's administrative staff had begun referring to the whole event in private channels using words that were, in any language, deeply unprofessional. Sovereign Elindra Voss of the Arath Imperium arrived on the second day with a fleet that made the docking authority visibly sweat. Her flagship alone was longer than some of the station's residential spines, and it moved with the kind of unhurried certainty that said, very clearly, that if there was a traffic problem, it would not be Elindra's problem. She stepped off the transit bridge and into Kaelos Prime's upper diplomatic ring, as though the air itself had been rearranged for her comfort. And perhaps it had. The environmental systems in the arrival corridor had been discreetly calibrated to Arath atmospheric preferences 3 hours before her ship even cleared the docking threshold. She was tall by human standards, though humans rarely saw her. Her skin held the pale luminescence of the Arath northern bloodlines, faintly blue-toned under artificial light, and her eyes were a deep amber that did not quite follow the rules of human eyes. They caught light differently, held it a fraction too long, released it when they were ready. Her hair was dark and worn in the elaborate structured form that Arath court tradition demanded for official functions, threaded through with filaments that served a dual purpose: aesthetic tradition and encrypted communication array. The Arath had long ago decided there was no reason beauty and function could not share the same architecture. What she was not, on any official record or in any public forum, was a mother in any state of visible anxiety. The sovereign of the Arath Imperium did not do visible anxiety. She did measured concern. She did composed deliberation. She had once received news of a border skirmish that destroyed 4 of her patrol ships while seated at a formal dinner, and her expression had not shifted by a single calibrated degree until she had excused herself with impeccable grace, walked calmly to the nearest secure communications room, and then, once the door had closed, begun issuing commands in a tone that made her senior admiral later describe the experience as the most frightening 11 minutes of my career. And I once flew through a collapsing star. Her daughter, Sevi, was 7 years old in Arath reckoning, closer to 5 by the developmental metrics most species used, and had been brought to the conclave because the court advisors had suggested, gently, that exposure to interspecies diplomatic environments at an early age would benefit the heir's political formation. Elindra had agreed, with the private caveat that Sevi would attend only the lower pressure functions and spend most of her time in the secured family quarters aboard the flagship with her attendants. What the advisors had not modeled for, because no political risk assessment ever does, was Sevi herself. The child had her mother's luminescent skin and absolutely none of her mother's composure. She was bright and quick and deeply, profoundly overwhelmed by the conclave's sheer volume of stimulation. The noise, the species, the smells, the lights, the constant movement of beings who came in shapes and sizes and colors that no illustrated archive had quite prepared her for. She had spent the first day pressed against her primary attendant's side, watching everything with enormous amber eyes. And by the second day, she had graduated to a wary, cautious exploration of the secured areas she was permitted to move through. No one had modeled for Sevi's sense of direction, either, which was catastrophically poor, and which she had clearly not inherited from her mother's side of the family. The first indication that something was wrong came at the evening meal, when her attendant, Torin, a composed and experienced woman who had served the imperial household for 16 years, and had survived 3 succession crises and 1 attempted coup with her dignity entirely intact, entered the family suite and found it 12 degrees too quiet. She checked the inner rooms. She checked the sleeping alcove. She checked the small observation nook Sevi had claimed on the first day by dragging a cushion to the viewport and announcing, with complete imperial authority, that this was now hers. The viewport had the cushion. It did not have Sevi. Torin stood in the center of the suite for 4 full seconds, which was, for someone of her composure, the equivalent of a lesser person screaming. Then she activated her comm and said, in a voice of extraordinary and carefully maintained calm, "I need to speak with the sovereign immediately." Elindra was in the middle of a bilateral discussion with the Hethari trade ambassador when her personal comm thread, the one reserved for family emergencies and nothing else, lit up with a priority designation she had never actually seen used in a non-drill context. She looked at it for one moment longer than she should have. The Hethari ambassador noticed and asked, diplomatically, if everything was well. "Perfectly," she said, and excused herself from the room with a grace so flawless that it was only afterward, reviewing the session recording, that the ambassador noticed she had left her data tablet behind, a thing in Arath diplomatic culture, essentially equivalent to leaving in one's undergarments. The station's security director, a Hethari named Voskale, whose 4 arms had each developed their own independent stress responses, received the alert at 21:04 station time and spent the next 40 seconds reading it in a state of perfect professional denial. Then he read it again. Then he set down the nutrient beverage he had been holding because his upper left arm had begun trembling slightly and he did not want to spill it on the console, because some dignities, however small, were worth preserving in a crisis. The heir to the Arath Imperium was missing. On his station. During the conclave. He later told his second-in-command that he had handled the news with complete composure, which was technically true if one defined composure as sitting very still for 11 seconds while making no sound whatsoever, and then standing up and beginning to issue commands in a voice pitched slightly higher than his usual register. Within the hour, Kaelos Prime had quietly, efficiently, and with the absolute minimum of public visibility, entered a lockdown state that touched every level of the station without announcing itself to any of the 42 delegations, currently sleeping, negotiating, or conducting elaborate ceremonial meals within its corridors. Biosignature scanners, the kind typically reserved for quarantine situations, and one memorable incident involving a Drathian ambassador and a stolen navigational core, were brought online across 17 of the station's 22 residential spines. Patrol rotations were doubled in the diplomatic ring and tripled in the transit corridors. Every security officer on shift was given a physical description of the child and told, in language that left absolutely no room for interpretation, that finding her was now the only thing that mattered until further notice. What no one told them, because the sovereign had requested absolute discretion, was why. The official internal communication listed the operation under a code designation that translated, loosely, to priority asset recovery, which led at least 3 officers to assume they were looking for some category of diplomatic contraband and spend a meaningful portion of their first sweep examining cargo manifests. Elindra herself had taken command of the search from the Imperial suite with a speed and structural precision that her senior advisor, watching her deploy intelligence resources across the station's network with the efficiency of someone who had long ago learned that emotion was a luxury best processed after the situation was resolved, found genuinely difficult to witness, not because it was alarming. Because he had served her for 22 years and he could see, underneath the precision, in the faint additional stillness around her eyes and the fractionally increased pace at which she was cycling through tactical overlays, exactly what it was costing her to be this calm. He offered her tea. It was all he could think to do. She accepted it without looking up and set it to the side untouched, which told him everything. By the second day, the search had expanded in ways that strained the definition of discretion. Arath intelligence operatives, people whose professional existence was a matter of significant debate among several treaty organizations, had been quietly inserted into the station's information infrastructure. The Conclave's own diplomatic security apparatus had been looped in under a cover narrative so carefully constructed that it was technically accurate in every individual detail, while being comprehensively misleading in every meaningful one. 3 other sovereign delegations, sensing that something was happening without knowing what, had begun their own low-level intelligence operations to find out, which created a secondary layer of covert activity that Voscale was now having to quietly monitor to ensure it didn't accidentally interfere with the primary one. It was, by any operational measure, a disaster that looked, from the outside, like a slightly tense diplomatic gathering. On the lower levels of the station, the maintenance and infrastructure spines that kept Kaelos Prime breathing, circulating, and structurally coherent, and which no diplomatic delegation had visited voluntarily in the station's entire operational history. None of this was visible at all. The lower levels had their own rhythms, their own social architecture, and their own considerable indifference to what happened in the diplomatic ring. The people who worked there had long ago developed a finely calibrated ability to sense when something political was occurring above them, and to continue fixing conduit junctions and recalibrating atmospheric processors with the practiced serenity of people who knew that whatever it would eventually require their infrastructure to continue functioning, and therefore they would still have jobs regardless of its outcome. Eli Vasquez had been on Kaelos Prime for 14 months. He was human, which in the context of the lower maintenance levels made him unremarkable. The station's infrastructure workforce was a genuinely diverse collection of species, and humans were present in numbers large enough to be ordinary, but small enough that no one had bothered to calibrate the break room temperature to their preferences, a recurring source of low-grade complaint that had become, over time, something of a cultural institution in its own right. He worked the atmospheric systems on Sublevel 9, which was unglamorous and technically demanding, and suited him reasonably well, because he was good with systems that had consistent and logical rules and considerably less good with systems that did not. A category which, in his experience, included most human social dynamics and at least 40% of the station's administrative processes. He lived in a single-occupancy crew quarter that was small but precisely organized, kept his tools in calibrated order, grew a small and slightly struggling herb plant on his viewport ledge, and generally asked very little from the universe beyond adequate sleep and functional decompressors. He had not expected, on the evening of the second conclave day, to open his quarter door after a long shift and find a small, luminous, amber-eyed child sitting on his corridor floor, clutching her own knees, looking up at him with an expression of absolute exhaustion and the specific, particular wariness of someone who has been frightened for a very long time and is no longer sure they have the energy left to keep running. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She stared at him. He looked down the corridor in both directions, which was empty, and then looked back at her. "Okay," he said, to no one in particular, in the tone of a man updating his expectations for the evening. Okay, he did not know what she was. That was the first problem, and in some ways the most manageable one, because not knowing what something was had a fairly straightforward solution, which was to observe it carefully and proceed with reasonable caution. Eli had spent 14 months maintaining atmospheric systems on Sublevel 9, and the fundamental operating principle of atmospheric systems, assess, stabilize, do not make anything worse, turned out to apply with surprising accuracy to small frightened children of indeterminate species found sitting on corridor floors. He crouched down to her level, which seemed like the correct instinct, and said hello in Standard, which was the only language he had. She did not respond in any way that suggested she understood Standard, but she also did not move away from him, which he decided to count as a reasonable beginning. Her eyes tracked him with an intensity that was slightly unnerving. Not hostile, exactly, more the quality of attention given by someone who has learned that attention is the only reliable early warning system available to them. He pointed to himself. "Eli," he said. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Then she said something in a language that sounded like water moving over smooth stone, musical and completely opaque, and watched him with an expression that suggested she was genuinely curious whether this would work. It did not work. They sat with that for a moment, two beings at the absolute outer edge of communicative possibility, and then Eli stood up, stepped back, and held the door to his quarters open in a way that was, he hoped, clearly an invitation rather than anything more alarming. She studied the open door. She studied him. She appeared to conduct some internal calculation that he was not privy to, and then she stood up. She was small, much smaller than he'd registered from standing height, and she moved with a careful, tired deliberateness, and walked past him into his quarters. He fed her, because that seemed like the next logical step, and because whatever species she was, the way she looked at the protein ration he heated suggested that hunger was a universal condition. She ate with both hands wrapped around the container in the manner of someone who has not eaten recently and is taking no chances on the situation reversing itself. He sat across from her at the small fold-out table and ate his own meal and did not stare, because staring at someone while they were hungry seemed unkind regardless of what sector of the galaxy you'd come from. He tried, that first evening, to figure out how to get her back to whoever had lost her. He checked the station's public communication board, which had no missing child reports on it, which he found strange, but attributed to possible cultural differences in how such things were handled. He considered going to the security post 2 corridors over, and then looked at her, and found that she had positioned herself in the corner of his quarters nearest the door with her back to the wall in a way that was not the posture of someone who wanted to be handed to an authority figure, armed or otherwise. There had been a patrol in the corridor earlier. She had heard it before he did, some auditory sensitivity he didn't share, and the way she'd gone very still and pressed back against the wall had told him more than any language could have. So he made a decision that he was aware, on some level, was probably not the officially recommended course of action, but which felt, in the specific texture of that specific moment, like the only decent one available. He pulled the spare maintenance blanket from his storage locker. It was thermal regulation grade, designed for cold conduit work, and warmer than anything else he owned. And he set it up in the corner she had chosen, because it was her corner now, apparently, and that was fine. And he went back to his side of the room and read his datapad and let her exist in his space without making it into anything more complicated than that. She watched him read for a very long time. He could feel it, the quality of attention, the slow recalibration of whatever internal assessment she was running. At some point, he didn't mark exactly when the quality of the silence changed. It became less like the silence of someone waiting for the situation to become dangerous, and more like the silence of someone who had tentatively, provisionally, decided that it might not. He did not know, on that first night, that the entire diplomatic infrastructure of a multi-system empire had begun to mobilize in the levels above him. He did not know that 14 intelligence operatives were at that moment working through the station's residential registry, trying to cross-reference biosignature anomalies with entry logs. He did not know that a security director was on his 4th stimulant beverage of the evening and seriously reconsidering his career trajectory. He knew that there was a small child in his quarters who had been frightened and was now, incrementally and with great personal caution, becoming slightly less frightened. He knew that his atmospheric maintenance shift started at 6:00, and that he could request a half-day personal leave without filing a formal reason, which he had never done in 14 months, but which he was going to do tomorrow, because leaving her alone in his quarters while she was still figuring out that the quarters were safe seemed like the wrong call. On the second day, he taught her, through a process of patient pointing and repetition that would have impressed a xenolinguistics specialist, and which he executed with the cheerful pragmatism of a man who fixed broken systems for a living, approximately 30 words in standard. She taught him 3 in her language, correcting his pronunciation with a fastidiousness that suggested linguistic precision was, wherever she came from, considered important. He got one of them right on the 4th attempt. She made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. He was inordinately pleased about this, in the way of someone who has accomplished something genuinely difficult, and celebrated by making them both a hot drink from his ration supply that was technically described as caf-substitute synthetic origin, and which tasted, honestly, like ambition without follow-through. She tried it, made an expression of diplomatic neutrality that did not fool either of them, and set it down very gently, which he respected enormously. By the 3rd day, he had learned her name, or the portion of it she had decided to offer him, which was Sevi, and she had learned to say Eli with a slight tonal inflection that his name did not technically possess, but which, in her language, he was beginning to suspect meant something like person who is not frightening, offered in the manner of a compliment. He had not called security. He had not filed a report. He had looked at her, each morning, and asked himself whether today was the day she seemed ready for that conversation, and each morning the answer had been, clearly and without ambiguity, no. He did not know he was harboring the heir to the Arath Imperium. He knew he was harboring a small person who had needed somewhere safe to be, and that this was a thing he was able to provide, and that it cost him very little, and that it seemed to matter to her enormously. He thought, on the third evening, watching her fall asleep against his side while he read. She had migrated from her corner over 2 days, in careful incremental stages, like a tide coming in, that whoever had lost her must be frantic. He thought tomorrow he would try harder to figure out how to find them. He thought, in the soft, specific quiet of that moment, that she looked entirely at peace. He turned a page on his datapad. He did not move his arm. The door to sublevel 9, corridor 4, junction 7 opened at 3:42 station time, and it opened the way all doors opened when Arath Imperial security was on the other side of them, with complete authority and the absolute minimum of ceremony. 6 operatives in the matte dark tactical suits of the Sovereign's personal detail moved through it in a formation that had been designed, over generations of Imperial protocol, to be simultaneously non-threatening and completely inescapable, which was a combination that required a great deal of practice to execute, and which looked, in the narrow maintenance corridor, slightly overcrowded. Elindra came through last. She had not slept in 3 days. This was not visible in any way that a stranger would have identified. Her bearing was exact. Her expression was composed with the precision of someone who had been composing it, consciously and deliberately, for 72 hours, because the alternative was something she had not permitted herself to consider until this moment. Her intelligence operatives had triangulated the biosignature 40 minutes ago. She had personally reviewed the scan 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it, and then she had moved, with a speed that her senior advisor later described as the fastest he had ever seen her move in 22 years of service, toward a part of the station she had never had reason to visit. She had expected many things. She had prepared, in the 40 minutes of transit, for a range of scenarios that her mind had catalogued and processed with ruthless efficiency, because preparation was the thing she could control, and she had needed, very badly, to be controlling something. She had prepared for a political extraction. She had prepared for a ransom negotiation. She had prepared, in the darkest and most carefully sealed compartment of herself, for things she was not going to name. She had not prepared for this. The operative at the front of the formation held up a closed fist. Halt, and Elindra moved around them to see through the small viewport set into the quarter door, and she looked, and she stood very still. Her daughter was asleep. Sevi was curled on a narrow crew bunk, tucked under a thermal blanket that was clearly designed for industrial use and not for small children, and she was breathing with the deep, complete regularity of someone who had been genuinely, thoroughly asleep for hours. Her face, which Elindra had spent 72 hours trying not to imagine in states of distress, was entirely peaceful. Beside her, sitting up against the bunk's back wall with a datapad resting on his knee and his eyes in the process of opening with the startled alertness of someone who has just heard a door open in the middle of the night, was a human. He was ordinary in every way that a person could be ordinary. He was wearing what appeared to be maintenance department sleep clothes. His hair was doing something that suggested it had formed its own opinions about the evening. He had one arm curved, loosely and without apparent thought, around Sevi's shoulders. When the operative opened the door and the light from the corridor fell into the room, Elindra watched the human's first instinct override everything else. He did not look at the 6 armed operatives. He did not look at the woman who had just come through a door with the weight of an empire behind her. He pulled his arms slightly closer around Sevi, with the automatic protectiveness of someone who is still 60% asleep and has identified, through whatever animal instinct governs such things, that there are unknown people in the space where a child is sleeping. Elindra's prepared fury, which she had been maintaining in careful suspension for the duration of the transit, met this image and did not know what to do with it. She stepped into the room. Her operatives moved to follow, and she stopped them with a gesture so slight it was barely a movement at all. She crossed to the bunk, and she looked at Sevi's sleeping face for a moment that she did not count and did not intend to, and then she looked at the human. He was now more fully awake. He was looking at her with an expression that was cycling, visibly and in real time, through confusion, alarm. A deeper alarm that arrived when he processed the operatives in the corridor. and then something that arrived at the end of all of that, which was not quite either of those things. A sort of exhausted, resigned calm, like a man who has decided that whatever is happening is now happening, and the most he can do is be reasonable about it. "She's yours," he said. It was not a question. He had apparently looked at Elindra's face and made several very accurate calculations very quickly. "She is," Elindra said. Her voice was even. She was extremely proud of this. The human nodded, slowly, in the manner of someone confirming a thing they had suspected but not been able to verify. "I did wonder," he said, "when nobody put up a missing child notice in the public system. I thought maybe it was a cultural thing." He paused. "It was more of a classified thing." "It was," Elindra said. "Right." He looked at Sevi, and his voice, which had been carefully measured in the way of someone being reasonable in a stressful situation, went slightly different. "She was scared when I found her, really scared. I didn't know how to find whoever she belonged to without. She didn't want to go near the patrols, the armed ones. She'd hear them coming before I did, and she'd go very still." He looked back at Elindra. "I didn't want to make it worse." There was a silence that had considerable weight in it. Elindra sat down on the single chair the quarters contained, because standing for this conversation suddenly seemed like the wrong architecture for it. Her senior advisor, watching through the corridor viewport, would later say that this was the moment he understood that the next hour was going to be a different kind of conversation than anyone had briefed for. The sovereign of the Arath Imperium did not, as a rule, sit in maintenance workers' chairs at 4 in the morning. And yet here she was, and the room around her seemed to receive this without comment, which said something about the room. "Why was she afraid of the patrols?" Elindra said. It came out less as a question than as someone saying something quietly that they had been not thinking for 3 days and had run out of the energy required to keep not thinking it. The human looked at her steadily. "I don't know. I couldn't ask her. We spent about 2 days working out enough words to have simple conversations. But she seemed like she'd been somewhere very loud and very overwhelming for a long time, and she needed it to stop." He paused. "The conclave, I'm guessing." Elindra said nothing. "She's smart," the human said, and there was something in his tone that was simply factual, the way someone reports on a system's specs because they are accurate. "She picked up words fast. She taught me some of hers. She laughed at my pronunciation, which, fair." He glanced at Sevi again. "She's going to be okay. She just needed somewhere quiet." Sevi chose this moment to shift in her sleep, reaching out with one small hand and finding the fabric of the human's sleeve, and closing her fingers around it with the decisive grip of someone who, even unconscious, has decided to keep hold of something important. The human looked down at this, and then looked at Elindra with an expression that said, clearly, that he understood this was not a simple moment, and that he was going to sit in it respectfully. Elindra looked at her daughter's hand on the sleeve of a maintenance worker she had never met, in a room that had no political significance and no strategic value, and no place whatsoever in the architecture of an empire, and felt something move through her that she was going to need a very long time and a great deal of privacy to properly examine. "She called you something," Elindra said, "in Arath when she talks in her sleep." The human raised an eyebrow. "It means approximately," Elindra said, "person who stayed." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a big thing to mean," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She looked at him, really looked. The way she looked at things she was deciding the full value of, and said, "I am going to have a great many questions for you. In a formal context, with proper channels and documentation, at a reasonable hour, after my daughter has slept." She paused. "And after I have slept, which I am told by everyone around me is a thing I should do." "That sounds reasonable," he said. "It is the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me in 3 days." She stood, and the full weight of who she was came back around her like a tide returning, and she looked at Sevi one more time. "She will need to come with me now." "I know." He very gently, with considerable care, unfolded Sevi's fingers from his sleeve. Sevi frowned in her sleep and then settled. He tucked the thermal blanket around her with the matter-of-fact